Hello and welcome to Jerry's Live. I'm your host Mott Tuman, and tonight I'm going to be showing you guys all about drawing people in perspective. As you guys know, this was a really highly requested one after our last two perspective drawing classes, so I'm pretty excited about that. I do want to point out that I'm not going to be going through the basic steps of perspective for this. If you watch it, you should not have any trouble understanding it, but when you're trying to draw this out for yourself or practicing on your own, I highly recommend that you go back to our other perspective drawing classes, particularly our first Intro to Perspective Drawing class, to get an understanding of the basics so you're not getting too confused over the terminology that I'm using. Because I'm going to move a little bit. Well, we've been moving fast for all of these, but I want to skip over the basics since you guys, many of you have watched that before, and get right into drawing more complicated anatomy and figures. That being said, before I get too far into things, make sure you go to JerrysArtarama.com and type in tonight's class code into the search bar if you want to see any of the products that I'm using tonight. That class code is JL321, so if you type that into the search bar, it'll bring up the teacher's cart with everything that I'm using if you have any questions about it or if you want to check out any of it for yourself. So, I'm going to get right into it. I have been practicing a lot for this, so I'm pretty stoked, but the first thing that we kind of need to talk about before I start getting into drawings or anything like that is proportions. Now, proportions are very important, and if we come down to our overhead here, I have a really large Soho drawing pad. That's what this is right here, and I have a smaller one as well that I'm going to be using. But like I've said before, I think it's best when you're doing perspective to start out with a large pad so you have lots of room to move around and to work out your perspective and to place your vanishing points, as I talked about in previous classes, far away so you can have a realistic looking perspective. So I got a large pad out here, and I have a small diagram that I've drawn right up here that talks a little bit about proportioning bodies. And I want you guys, as I'm doing this class, to keep this in mind, but not get too bogged down in it. I find a lot of people, when they first start drawing humans, they can get really bogged down in trying to make the proportions absolutely correct, which is a good thing to do, and it's a good thing to always keep in mind. But proportions is something that is kind of flexible, more flexible than you'd think, right? So right here, I have a person that is standing 8 heads tall. So that's generally how you break it down with proportions, is like how many heads, like this one singular square is this person's head, tall is this. So this person's 8 heads tall, and they are 3 heads wide. So that's lots of times how you do it when you're breaking down proportions of a person. And generally, this is what I stick to, is sticking to that 8 head proportion about. But this can change. Some people prefer to draw people at only 7 heads tall when figuring out the proportions, while other people might go even as high as 13 heads tall. If you've ever seen the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, I believe God, as he is illustrated in that image, is actually 13 heads tall. So he looks almost mythical in a way because of that proportion stretch. His head looks very small and the rest of his body looks massive. And so the artist was really playing around with the proportions of that to get that effect of like the mythology and everything around that. So it's something you can play with a little. It's something that's a little more flexible than a lot of people will tell you when you're first starting out. But this 8 heads tall, it's a good rule to follow. Lots of people, 7.5 is a good one that lots of people will use as well. You kind of have to figure out what you want yours to look like. Even like my figure right here, the way I've broken it up, I would actually make the pelvis and the rib cage area longer if I were to do this again right now. This is something I did a couple months ago. But you can see I have it evenly spaced out so that each grid of this is going to be one width of this boxy head. And this is really what we're going to be starting out with when we're trying to draw people, is we're going to be breaking the anatomy of a person down into really, really simplified forms. So just boxes, spheres, and circles before we get too hung up in drawing specific anatomy. So that is what I'm going to be using right now. A few key things to note is where things lie relative to each other. And so, like, your head always going to land in about the center of your shoulders. One important thing to note is that your hands most of the time will fall about mid-thigh. So I actually drew, if I bring up right here, this was the image that I used for the thumbnail on the show. You could see this little guy looking very sad in the corner, and he's asking, why are my arms so long? Because when I drew this, he's not standing up straight or anything like that, so I had a harder time judging proportions. You could see his arms look extremely long. They actually look longer than the legs, which took me a while to see. But again, You don't want to get too bogged down with proportions because sometimes it can make your figures look really, really stiff when you're starting out if you're thinking about it too mathematically. So I do encourage you to be loose with it, to have it in mind, but to not let it control everything that you're doing when you're first starting out. So with that being said, I think we can get right into drawing different parts of the body. I wanted to start out with drawing the torso and showing you how you can draw a simplified torso, and then moving out from there, showing you how you can draw the head, arms, legs. There's lots of different ways that you can do it, and there's lots of different ways that people will do it. But when you're thinking just about capturing perspective and thinking about turning someone in perspective, I think the best place to start out is just with boxes, like I showed you in that illustration right there. So in previous classes, I had you guys drawing out a perspective grid layout with a horizon line and vanishing points. And again, if you guys haven't seen that class, it is a really good one to go back to because I want you guys to keep those things in mind. I want you to keep in mind where your horizon line might be and where your vanishing points might be. But I encourage you when you're drawing people to not actually physically put them on the paper, because drawing all those different lines and things can really start to bog things down very quickly. So I really encourage you to go back and practice just drawing boxes and squares in perspective on that grid line, and then if you're going to tackle drawing a person, just draw the boxes. Just try to imagine those lines going towards your vanishing point, try to imagine where your horizon line might be, and tackle it from there. So if I have just a simple box right here, it's a little bit longer than it is tall, that is going to be a good basis for the start of your rib cage, which is kind of where we want to start out. We're essentially doing a very simplified skeleton structure to begin with. I think that is a great place to start out, and then the next thing you kind of want to start thinking about is your pelvis, or like your hips, right? If we're just thinking about the skeletal structure. And I'm going to draw it in line with how my rib cage is up here. So I'm going to draw it following about the same perspective. And an important thing to note is that I'm keeping in mind where my perspective points are and where this is vanishing towards. So right now, as I'm drawing this person, I can see the top part of where their shoulders would be, which is up here. So I know I'm kind of looking down on them in the perspective I'm drawing now. So if you can see the top of the cube that will be your rib cage, that means that you are looking down on someone rather than looking up on them, or rather than looking at them head on. So when I go to draw the pelvis, I'm gonna make sure that I see even more of this top plane than I do up here, since it is getting farther away from us. So I can show you an example of that in just a second, but actually this might be a bit too, this is almost the exact same size as the rib cage. You do want it to be a bit smaller than your rib cage, so let me make that a bit smaller. And I actually, this time, took some advice from the comments, and I got a 24 set of color pencils to do this, so you guys can see this illustrated in different colors, hopefully a bit cleaner than it was when I just did it in graphite, so I could point out things without bogging the image down too much. That is also a great tip if you're just starting out drawing perspective. Using different colors to distinguish different parts of the body is going to help you a lot. So I have my pelvis right here and my rib cage up here. And once I have those two set down, I kind of want to think about how I'm going to start connecting them. And I think just starting out with these two boxes and thinking about how you're going to connect them with the waist is a great place to start. And so when you think about your anatomy, you have your rib cage, you have your pelvis, and then in between those you have your stomach, you have all of your, I think, serratus muscles. I'm probably naming that incorrectly, but basically you have a lot of softer tissue in between your rib cage and your pelvis. So everything that goes in between there is going to be softer and it's going to move a bit more. So I kind of want you to think about this bottom square as a pelvic bone, and all of the fat and muscle and everything else that's going between your rib cage and your pelvic muscles are going to be resting on top of that. So if I start to draw out some softer tissue, I'm going to give it a little bit of bend to it. If you've ever done animation, a good thing to think about is squash and stretch. You know, when you're drawing out a ball, how does it fold in and how does it expand depending on how you're turning an object? So this is going to be just a straight on person that we're looking at. So our soft tissue in the middle isn't going to be doing anything crazy. I'm just essentially going to make sure it has a little bit of a curve down on the bottom here that indicates all of that kind of fat and muscle sitting on top of the pelvic bones. Because it doesn't really matter how skinny a person gets, unless they are extremely malnourished, they're gonna have some amount of fat or body muscle sitting on top of those pelvic bones. So that's kind of getting more into like specific anatomy and thinking about how you can capture realism. So we're gonna still keep things boxy, but I'm gonna start pointing out a few key anatomical things to note like that. You can even draw in, if it's helpful, a belly button. That'll kind of help you see perspective a little bit when it's going down like the center plane of your person. And this is where I would really start. Like take this, just your upper rib cage, your lower pelvis, and then that soft tissue in between, and just start orienting it in space in different ways. And I can actually show you guys an example I have of that in here, which is a fairly simplified image of it here. This is where I was just taking those different shapes and I was orienting them in space in different directions. So you just kind of want to start out just turning it. And then once you get a good hang of just turning things around in space, that's when you want to start considering how you're going to flex things and like rotate them around. So right here, I have it where this person's body's kind of bending forward. It's leaning in on itself. And you can see I started very simply to suggest that this soft tissue in the center is stretching on this side, and then it's squashing together a little bit on this side. And this is just a very simple illustration of it. It's not a great capturing of the anatomy, but it's gonna help you a lot as you start to develop these further and add more muscle and more fat and think about how a person's gonna look realistically. So just doing that and trying to capture like this side, since I have this shape right here leaning towards us and this shape right here also kind of angling downwards and leaning towards us, this side is gonna appear longer than the other side. It's gonna stretch while the other side is gonna start squashing down. And this, again, it's still very boxy what I have in the center here, and I would even encourage you to try and draw it a little bit more realistically than what I have, because this is, again, very, very boxy. You kind of want to think it more as like a soft tube, like if you were to take a bag of rice and set it on top of a cube, how that would flow down over the cube. Think about that a bit when you're trying to imagine how this is going to like squash and stretch in space. So just figuring out this torso is gonna be one of the more complicated things with this. And honestly, it's some of the most subtle anatomy that occurs in the body happens just in the torso. So if you're able to get this part of the body more realistically, it's gonna help you a lot before you even try tackling arms or legs, which can get very gangly and very unwieldy quickly when you're drawing. So once you have this kind of setup in space, that is when you can start tackling arms and legs. But before I get too far into that, I do want to show you guys, once you've advanced kind of beyond this cube, how you can start to draw it to capture a bit more realism. So start out with the cube. If you get really good hang on that, that's when you can start drawing your rib cage a bit more realistic. And the best way to do that is still with a simplified version, but you can start out drawing just an ellipse in space like this, because your rib cage, it's very rounded and it's gonna take on more of the form of an ellipse. And I encourage you, I have this marked down as my center line in the middle of my cube here. Do the same thing when you're doing your ellipse. This is going to help you see the perspective a bit more, because one of the reasons you want to start out drawing cubes instead of like rounder forms when you're starting out drawing people in perspective is because it's really hard to see perspective on a circular form. Because if I take a sphere and I twist it around in space and I pull it farther away from me and closer to me, it's almost always gonna look like a sphere, which makes it easier in some ways and harder in others because I'm not able to see what the differing perspectives is doing to this shape as much as I can see it in a cube, which is why you really want to start out just looking at a cube and moving it around in space. But if you just start marking out the center line of your torso, make sure you give it a bit of like a rounded shape, like drawing an egg. From there, you can start to get what your lower ribs look like. So if I come in here, I can see more of this side than I can of the other side. I'm basically just gonna split it a bit down the middle and try to capture that general shape of the rib cage, which is gonna basically have a little cutout in it, and then each side of the rib cage swoops down. And that's basically a simplified form of our rib cage. Now, an important thing to note here, once you have this figured out, this part of the rib cage is you're gonna see more of the front face of this than you're going to see the back. And so I'm gonna draw this out from a side plane so you get a better idea of what I mean. But if I draw a rib cage trying to capture it realistically from the side, it has almost a bit of an angle right there. Here, I'm gonna draw this out darker so you guys can see. Where the back comes up and it's flatter than the front plane of your egg. So that's something to think about. If you get really good at drawing this, try capturing the rib cage so that this is the front side of a person's body and this is the back side, where this plane of it is a bit flatter and a bit pointier coming out than your back plane. So that's something to think about, and that's gonna come in handy later when we're talking about how to connect this to the neck as we're drawing that. So coming back to this shape right here, going into the pelvis, I still think it's great even if you get more advanced with this to start out just with a cube for the pelvis. And I should mention here, we're not going to get too much into depicting actual body fat when we're getting into this, so we're not going to be able to see much about differentiating between men and women or more masculine and feminine bodies. But a good place to start out with that is really the pelvis. If you want someone that looks more feminine, your pelvis is going to be a bit wider and it's going to kind of taper a bit more. Whereas a masculine pelvis is going to be a little bit boxier than like a woman's would. So if you're already thinking ahead to what gender that you want to depict, that is something to start thinking about, is just the pelvic region, and the waist region is gonna tell you the most about that, honestly, when you're just looking at anatomy. So I got my boxier cube down here that I've tried to put into the same perspective where I'm seeing more of this side of it than the other side. The same as up here, I'm seeing a bit more of this side, so I know to cover it more. But again, I'm looking more on top of this. I'm keeping in mind where my imaginary horizon line is, so I'm going to see more of the top of this pelvis right here. And what happens is that you basically want to take the corners of this pelvis and you want to imagine that as the corners of your hip bones. Like lots of people like me have hip bones that stick out. You can actually feel them. That is what those points are, and that's what, again, like I said earlier, your body and your fat and your muscle and whatever you have in the center of your body, all of your organs are kind of going to be resting on top of those points. But in the more complicated version of this, you probably want to start thinking about very simplified anatomy. So I'm going to touch a little bit on key areas of anatomy that you can pay attention to, but it's still going to be very simplified. And one of the things that you can pay attention to on the front part of this body that's going to be the easiest thing for you to start marking in is your abdominal muscles. The rectus abdominis, I believe is what it's called. Which kind of, when you're talking about your pelvis, it kind of makes this V shape in the front. And the rectus abdominis muscles connect to the upper part of your rib cage and then again connect to the front part of your pelvis. So they're going to look basically like a rectangle that's kind of split down the middle like this. So when you're thinking about that squash and stretch later, this is that soft tissue that's going to start, as it forms, starts to cave in on itself. Like if I draw really quickly, this is my rib cage, and then this right here could be my pelvis as seen from the side. These rectus muscles, the abs, I should just say the abs, try to stop giving myself a tongue twister. Your abs are going to start folding like this. You know, they're going to start folding in on themselves as the body is kind of scrunched forward. And then the muscles that you have in your back and like your spinal column is going to stretch kind of like that. So that's, I'm going to hold it up so you guys can see a little better. It kind of looks like a funky looking face. But these are your abs right here. They would start folding in. The structure, as it is soft, would start scrunching in on itself. And then the back muscles would start stretching. So this is what it would look like from the side. And then from there, you're going to do the same thing that you did over on this structure where you're adding in that side fat and that body fat. That's going to kind of drape down and sit on top of those points. And that's how you can kind of start getting in a bit more of a realistic looking anatomy for your torso. And then you can go on to add like your pecs and your shoulder muscles. And actually I'm going to start adding in shoulders over here on this side. So shoulders, easy place to start out with. You kind of just want to depict them as a simple sphere coming off the side of your rib cage. And again, I'm seeing more of this side of the rib cage than I am over here. So my shoulder bone is, I'm not going to see very much of it. It's just going to peek out a little bit. So just keep that in mind. You want to, again, keep that invisible perspective plane in mind while you're drawing. From there, the arm, long and gangly. It seems very intimidating, but I promise you it's not too bad. The top part of your arm, the upper part of your arm, is really just a very simple tube. Yes, tube. And it tends to be pretty straight on both sides. Like this upper part of the arm tends to be like a pretty straight, even tube when it comes down. You can see here, I have this arm lifted up a little bit. So I'm thinking about how I want to orient this in space. If I want that arm lifted up, it means I'm going to see more of the bottom than I am of the top. And I also want to show you guys one thing here, because this can get important when you're depicting arms. I need to remember where I put my sheet real fast. Oh, there it is. I have a lot of reference sheets under here, just in case. So I was hoping we could get through a bit more information that I have in previous classes. So I pulled this out. Again, here's the horizon line. This is 2-point perspective. So I have 2 vanishing points here that these cubes are vanishing towards. But I wanted to give you, this is kind of the imaginary, or the image you should have in your head as you're doing this, that you should keep in mind. That, again, as I showed you here, I'm looking down on this. It's below my horizon line, so I'm going to see more of the top plane of this. And so when I started to do this arm, I'm seeing a lot of the bottom plane, and that means this top plane of this tube right here is going to be rounder. And by that, I mean, if we look over here, you can see this cube, this bottom plane of the cube and the top plane of it is a lot flatter, even though it is an angle, it's a lot flatter than this cube right here. You see how this has a much sharper angle on the bottom? That's because as things get further away from that horizon line, they're gonna start taking on sharper angles as they get farther away. And the same is true for cylinders. That's what I was trying to say earlier. This is a cylinder. That as this point, if I'm seeing more of this bottom plane, that means this top corner right here is gonna get rounder and rounder. So the more of this circle that I see, the more this has to protrude out. So keep that in mind whenever you're drawing cylinders. If you're seeing a lot of this bottom plane, then this other plane is gonna be protruding out more. So if I'm, like if you start drawing this, and then if I draw it so that it has less of a plane that's protruding out, then this side right here, you can see how that immediately starts to look less cylindrical than my arm right here. So make sure you're keeping these edges more rounded than your edge down here. Okay, getting back into arm anatomy though, that's a very important thing to keep in mind whenever you're drawing perspective, is just having this imaginary plane and remembering the 2 key things is that as they get farther away from your vanishing point, you're gonna have sharper or rounder edges, and as things get farther away from you, they're going to get smaller. Those are really the 2 most important key points that you have to keep in mind when you're starting to draw people in perspective. So I got that cylinder for the arm. The next part of the arm, we're actually gonna kind of skip the elbow for a second because I want you kind of to think of these as shapes floating in space. I don't want you to think of them as one whole form just yet, because that's how you can get things looking a little bit too stiff. So I want you to just think of them, these are individual forms floating in space. I'll talk about the elbow in a little bit, but this next part of the forearm is slightly different. You can draw it as just a cylinder. If you're having a lot of trouble depicting anatomy and anything in perspective, you can draw a forearm just as a cylinder. But I would encourage you, when you're drawing out your forearm, to think of it more as a cylinder that is wider at this point, closer to your elbow, and as it gets towards the wrist, it becomes more square-like. So you can actually see on my own wrist right here, I have that ulna bone that's kind of sticking out. It becomes very much more like a square. So as I continue this wrist down, I'm going to make it a little bit boxier. And when it comes to drawing in the hand and the wrist, that's going to help you a lot. It's gonna look a lot more realistic quickly if you draw this as a boxier point rather than having it as a rounded cylinder. Because your hand, once it comes down, and I can even draw this in a different perspective so you can see a little bit better what I mean. So I have basically a rounded form closer to the elbow, and then as it gets closer to the wrist, I might even add another line in here and have it end in a square-like shape so that you have that simplified form of this forearm. And then once you get to this more square-like shape, that's where you can start drawing in the hand, which I'm going to keep very simple for this class, as I could have a whole nother class of just drawing hands. They are very complicated. The hand is gonna look, again, kind of like a boxier shape that can flex a little bit. So if you see, you know, my hand can curve this way, and then it can also curve in that way, but it still keeps kind of that rectangular shape. So I'm gonna have a bit of rectangular shape here. And then fingers, I just want you guys to think about them as little thin tubes or cylinders right now. You can split up your finger into all 3 different joints if you want, and then that gets into a whole nother array of complexity. But we're not going to focus on that too much today because I just want to show you guys the main parts of getting the body down. But I am going to talk about your thumb a little bit. Your thumb, a little bit different. You don't just want to draw a tube that's coming out from the hand, but you want to think about this muscle right here connecting to the rest of the forearm kind of comes out like a triangle from this part of it. I'm going to hold this up in a second so you can see. And then your thumb kind of comes out more tube-like, or really more like a circle than anything. So I'm going to hold this up. So you can see my very, very basic drawn out hand right here, where I have that square-like shape in, and then this is the triangle that is connecting the thumb to the rest of the hand, to the palm of the hand. And then I only have 2 fingers drawn out, so I can draw out 2 more. That's my very basic hand. And that's kind of how you want to start structuring it, very simply. And you can even, when you're starting out drawing these hands, if they're really intimidating to you, just pretend like all of these fingers are one big chunk. You can even split it up into like 2 chunks if you want. You know, just draw it out kind of like a very lazy triangle where you have your pointer finger might be a bit longer, or you could do it, you know, depending on the shape of your fingers, you could do it a bit more like that. But keep it simple. Don't be afraid to take anatomy and put it into one big boxy chunk and then break it down from there and then start splitting up into individual muscles of what the arm looks like and everything. Because you really want to keep things simple, especially when you're thinking about perspective. What was it? I had an art teacher in high school that always told me, keep it simple, stupid. KISS. That's the acronym. Simplify as much as you need before getting into anything that's too complex. So that is how you can tackle the arm. I want to get into tackling the head right now. I can draw out really quickly at the end of this a bit more of a complicated form, but for now I just want to talk about getting this basic kind of figure drawn out. So I'm gonna get a different pencil just because that one was getting pretty dull and I don't want to take time out to sharpen it. So I got a red pencil now, so this guy's gonna be multicolored. That's okay. So talking about the neck, what I was talking about earlier with the rib cage and this part of it being a bit flatter, that's because your neck naturally wants to tilt forward on your body. If you can look at me in the picture-in-picture here, your neck is going to naturally want to tilt forward. This doesn't mean you have a hunchback. It's very natural for our necks to do this and our spinal column to tilt down that way. And so when you're depicting this, I want you to think if you're starting out with a box, you could just go straight into drawing kind of a tube for the neck, where you take the base of that and just draw it out as an angle. Or you could even, when you're drawing out your cubes like this, if you're kind of stuck between these 2 stages, you can draw out your cubes so that it has an angled plane coming down rather than a flat plane on top. And that can help you a lot. So if I tried drawing the neck out here, this neck is coming towards us a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually overlap these spheres that are different parts of the neck. And this is keeping it very tubular. And this might even be tilted a little too far forward. Like this guy's leaning towards us a bit because I'm seeing a lot of this top plane of the cylinder. But this is getting into what is known as foreshortening. And foreshortening is something that I touched a little bit about in the advanced perspective drawing class, but I'm going to touch on it a little bit more now because I want to draw our head in. And what's going to happen is that the top of a head, since this figure is leaning towards us, is going to be blocking a lot of the neck and the shoulders. We're not going to see that much of it because of how this is oriented in perspective. And for the head, I just want to draw a cube to start out with. So I'm going to try drawing in the base plane of this cube, which I'm going to keep in mind that the back of your head and your neck is not a straight line. Unless if you're a baby and you slept too much on your back, I guess that can happen. But typically you have a bit of your head coming out at a lip at the base of your neck. So I'm going to make sure I draw the base of my head if I'm drawing it out as a cube. And again, I'll lift this up so you guys can see a bit closer. A little bit beyond the base of my neck. And then I'm coming out so that it extends farther towards the front than it does against the back. And you can keep this a bit like a rectangle shape. And from there, this head's, I'm going to make it come up at a slight angle. So I'm basically going to build a very boxy cube from this. And actually, this might not be tall enough for my head. Again, keep in mind proportions, but I want you guys to really focus on just building structure before you get too bogged down in proportions. And this is a very, very lumpy looking head that I've drawn here. I'm holding this up and I'm talking and I'm thinking a bit too hard about it. Yes, we have a question.
How are you guessing or judging or gauging the length of each of these shapes?
Yeah, so that's a bit what I'm getting into when I'm talking about proportions, is that I have done this a lot. I've done this again and again and again, and I've started to be able to judge proportions without consciously thinking about it. So that's kind of what I want you guys to start out doing, is I want you to just be able to capture the figure and capture the idea of the figure and the shape of it, because when you start getting into proportions, you can get a little too mathematical and a little too stiff. So when I'm drawing out this head right here, I'm keeping in mind the general idea that this boxy shape of the head should be about like actually I've made it a bit too small, so my proportions are off here. But one of these should be able to fit right next to it right here, and then again on the other side, keeping in mind that things are getting smaller as they're getting farther away. And that would be a well-proportioned head in terms of how it is with the shoulders. And so that's kind of how I'm keeping it in mind. I should have made this head a little bit larger, so it's kind of small right now, but keep it in the back of your head. If you need to draw out a chart like I did earlier, like this one right here, I highly encourage you, draw a chart like this where you have it measured out however many heads tall you want it to be, however you would like to proportion it, and then keep that in front of you while you're drawing. And I can even post this to the Jerry's Live Facebook group after the show if you guys would like that as a resource. I am happy to do that. There are a bunch of images like this similarly online. If you look up drawing proportions of a person, you're gonna find stuff like this that you can use to reference. For the Jerry's Live Facebook group, though, if you want to join, make sure you answer the security question, otherwise we have to deem you a robot and we can't let you in. So heads up on that. But proportions, again, like I said earlier, they're flexible and they can change a little bit, and they differ from person to person. This person that I've drawn out here has somewhat shorter legs than most people do. And that's kind of like my own proportions have kind of tainted that a bit because I have shorter legs. I'm quite short. And so part of this was thinking about how I'm proportioned. And I was actually like, stand up in front of a mirror and look at how, like, where do your hands fall if you're just holding them by your side? And then how does that look if you scrunch your arms up? Your forearm to your hand is about the same length as your elbow to your shoulder. So when you're thinking about drawing these arms out, think about trying to keep them even, but then also keeping in mind that these things can flex and change a little bit depending on the person that you are drawing. So that is kind of how you want to keep proportions in mind. This is similar to the legs. Your upper thigh is a very, like, kind of to your hip. It's very similar length to your lower leg, but it actually tends to be just a slight bit longer because it extends all the way up to the hips. Speaking of which, I can start showing you guys. Actually, I gotta finish talking about the head before I can get into the hips. I can't get ahead of myself. So I hope that answered your questions well. Again, I can post that as a resource into the Jerry's Live Facebook group. If you guys would like that, please let me know in the chat. So, heads. This is very scribbly, so I'm going to draw you a better version so you can see a little bit better. In fact, I might actually use my little body over here that I've been forming. So I'm going to start out, again, drawing the base plane of that neck, and maybe I'll position this a little bit differently so we can see this perspective a little bit more. So maybe I'll have the neck coming out, facing towards the side a little bit more, and I'm just going to be drawing that as a tube. And since I'm not seeing, again, this one was tilted towards us, we saw a lot of that top plane of the neck. It's going to be tilted a little bit away from us in this, and so this top plane of the neck, we're not going to see as much of it because it's being tilted away from us. And so I'm going to draw it out a little bit thicker so you guys can see it since it is quite small. And then when I'm placing the head on top of this, I can do it as a cube like I did right there, where I just have the head sitting on top. And I'm going to draw, when you're drawing things without a perspective grid, I encourage you to draw one plane at a time. So I was getting a little bit ahead of myself right here, but if I just draw this side plane, I think, how much of the side of the head do I want to see? If this person is turning away from me and I want to see the lot of the side of their head, I'm going to draw the side of the box first, and I'm going to make it the largest portion that I see. And then from there, as I draw things out in perspective, I'm going to make sure the top plane of this head, I'm going to see a bit less of it, since he's tilting away from me, and then the front plane of this head where the face would be, I'm also going to see a bit less of it. And this is a very, very simplified version of this head, so I'm going to show you a better way that you can draw it in just a second, because this doesn't really capture the anatomy of the face very well. Yes, we have a question.
How well do these pencils erase?
Pretty well. They are colored pencils, and I know most colored pencils do not erase the greatest. Like, they'll erase, but there'll still be some kind of pigment left over or staining left over, so I can show you right here. If I start erasing this, I'm gonna still see the residue of these lines a little bit, but they're pretty good. But if you want a better version, non-photo blue pencils is the way to go with this. And I have these in the teacher's cart exactly if this question was asked. So these are blue pencils. Originally they were created so that if you scanned them in, this certain shade of blue wouldn't show up in your scan. So you could use it to sketch things out, put ink lines on top, and then your sketch lines would vanish. Modern day copiers and things can pick up on this color of blue, but it's a colored pencil that is easier to erase than regular colored pencils, which is why a lot of people still prefer it for sketching. So if you want one that's easier to erase, a non-photo blue pencil is going to be great for you. Part of the reason I'm not using that on the show tonight is just because it's a little bit harder to pick up on camera because of that shade of blue is a little bit harder for us to see. It's very pale. But that is a great option for you if you would like something that erases a bit easier than regular colored pencils. So, getting back into anatomy of the head right here, you can start drawing it out just a simple cube. You want to keep in mind though, essentially your head is going to be a round sphere where the skull is, and then a mask placed on that sphere. So if I draw this out from a side view, I have the sphere of the head right here where your skull is, and then it's going to be your face. It's kind of like a mask stuck onto that. And you can pull this line up to connect it to that. Your draw is actually going to come out a bit more of an angle than that. But essentially it is just a straight plane, right, connected to a rounder plane. There's lots of different ways that you can draw this out. Again, I've seen people draw it out like this, where it's literally just like a slightly curved plane stuck on a circle. And then the sides of the head might be a bit flatter. If you start feeling your own head, or if you start looking at skulls as references, the sides of them might be a bit flatter. And then on this, if I come back to this right here, your neck again is going to naturally come out at a curve rather than coming out straight on like this. This is going to start looking a little bit unnatural. So this is where you're going to have that natural curve of the neck. Key points to look out for. I highly encourage you guys to go and find a reference image or to look at yourself in a mirror and to kind of orient your head in space and try to find these simplified shapes. So I wanted to point out a few key anatomical things that you can look out for if you're trying to do that. So one thing is the ear. Your ear is going to be a really, really great way to tell where your head is oriented in perspective, especially if you're using this more circular kind of shape rather than this boxier shape. It's going to be a lot easier to see the perspective if you see the ear. So I have this head where it's kind of tilting away from us, so I'm going to see a good chunk of the back of the ear. But if I draw a head from above, where this is the top plane of my head, and then let's say I have the face right there, and I wouldn't see much of the neck or anything, maybe I'd see like a tiny bit of the neck coming up from the back, then I would be able to still see my ears poking out from the sides of the head like this, and that's going to give me a good idea of how that head is oriented rather than just seeing a straight sphere. So ears are a great anatomical point to look out for when you're drawing people, and another great thing to look out for when you're depicting the neck is that we're going to draw this as a simplified tube or like a cylinder when we're trying to capture perspective, but the neck is much more complicated than that. So if you're trying to draw people, or I highly recommend do gesture drawing in accompaniment with doing this kind of more structural breaking down of shapes, because it's going to help you loosen up your drawings a lot. Gestural figure drawing, you know, if you go to any figure drawing classes. And I believe we have a class on gesture drawing that Emmy did maybe a year or two ago, if you guys want to look that one up. But a key thing to look out for in the neck is to keep in mind that it's not just a tube, it's a slightly more complicated, and one of the really prominent muscles in the neck is called the sternocleidomastoid, which is, if we again look at the front-facing camera right here, I'll show you on me. If I look at my neck right here and I try to tilt it, you'll see I have a straight line coming up from almost the base of my ear here at the corner of my jaw down to the front where my clavicle is. That is a really prominent muscle in the neck that's going to make your neck look a lot more realistic. So if I turn my head here, you can see it a bit better, I think. I can't see it on the camera, but I think you can. If I turn my head, you can start to see that muscle a bit better. That is a really key muscle that you can place in there to make your neck look a bit more realistic if you're drawing. So if I even come in here and try to like draw it out a bit, I would see just like the corner of it peeking up in this perspective. Since I have this head turning away from me, it it would be kind of lining up with that muscle. So that's an important muscle to look out for when you're starting to find these key points. So, and even if I come to my person right here with this very wonky looking head, another thing to look out for when you're trying to add arms in, if you want to start getting to more complicated anatomy, is your clavicles are very important. I just said that sternocleidomastoid kind of inserts into the base of your clavicles, and those clavicles are going to have a little bit of a U right at the base of the neck, and then they're going to come out pretty straight and kind of connect into where your shoulders start, right? And those same clavicle muscles are going to kind of form a chest plate with the pecs, your pectoralis muscles. So if I draw in some very simplified pectoralis muscles, they tend to begin right at the kind of insertion of your rib cage right here where your abs insert. They tend to begin like right above that, and then they kind of curve up into where the shoulder would be. And then from there, they insert into where your top shoulder muscles are gonna be. This is a very simplified version of anatomy as well. So if you're like an anatomist or, you know, if you know very specific anatomy, I'm simplifying this a lot. So keep that in mind if you go to study it, but then I would have the same chest plate would come up a little bit on the side to connect with that other shoulder that's over here and kind of form its own front-facing plate. And kind of this musculature right here, if you're trying to make the neck and the upper shoulders and everything look more realistic, this would kind of wrap around the body like a shaw when it connects with the trapezius muscles in the back. So you would have a more triangular trapezius muscle coming up in your back and kind of wrapping around that neck like a shaw. Something to keep in mind. I'm getting a little bit advanced here though, because I want to get into drawing very simplified hips and legs before we get too far. So, drawing legs, very similar to drawing arms. If I come down to where my pelvis is right here, I want you to keep in mind that you shouldn't just put whatever sphere you're going to put on the bottom of the legs sticking out like this. You can, if you're really trying to simplify things, but this is not going to be able to capture a super realistic anatomy. What a better thing to do is think about how your legs actually connect to your pelvis. And so if this is my pelvic bone, the leg bones more connect onto the side of it. And so if I draw an X through the side of my pelvic square right here, and I find that center point, this is gonna kind of be where the beginning of your bone is for your thigh. And so I'm gonna take that and then I'm gonna imagine it as like a hinge connecting to this tube that I'm gonna draw as the upper thigh. So let's say I want this upper thigh to be coming towards us a little bit, like lifted up a little bit. So I would draw the first plane of this thigh, the first like sphere of this thigh, and remember I'm having it come towards us. And since it's coming towards us, I know I'm gonna see this front circle of the thigh. I'm gonna see a good amount of it since it is coming towards us. And this back sphere is gonna be curved quite a bit because of what I said earlier about cylinders moving in perspective. The more of this plane that I'm going to see, the more this back, I'm messing up terminology, excuse me, the more this back circle is gonna be curved. So I'm gonna start connecting those two to get kind of the cylinder that forms the hip and the thigh. So from there, I wanna start thinking about knees. Lots of different ways that you can draw kneecaps. I encourage you, when you're just thinking about how to capture things in perspective, to draw your knee kind of like a box. And I just realized that I skipped going over the elbow, so I will come back to that in just a second, once we get through the leg. But your knee has a lot of hard plating right there. I believe it's called your patella, is that really hard part on the front of the knee that can be super painful if you bend it the wrong way. But since it has such hard bone and muscle that sticks out there, similar to your wrist, where I had you guys form that into more of a square boxier shape as it got towards the bones of the wrist, I encourage you guys to draw out the kneecap as more of a boxy structure. It's gonna help you be able to get your leg in perspective a bit better, and it's gonna be able to capture that boniness of the knee a little bit better than just having a more spherical shape would. So you can draw it out as just a sphere if that's what floats your boat. Again, everyone has their different methods for doing this, so whatever works for you is the best method to do it. Explore different methods. This is what I use to help get my mind more in the frame of how to get realistic anatomy, since that is what I like to depict. Using that square shape can kind of help me picture how this leg is situated in perspective better than just using the sphere, especially when most of the leg is just these very cylindrical shapes. And then let's say I want to draw the lower part of the leg coming down towards the floor. So it's kind of bent and coming towards us, like you're walking up the stairs, this person's walking up the stairs towards you. So that lower part of the leg is going to be really similar to that front, this lower part of the arm, or upper part of the arm, I guess, is however you look at it. But I'm going to start drawing out, since I want this leg to be coming down, I'm going to start seeing more of the top plane of the cylinder. That's going to be the lower part of the leg, right? And it's going to be connecting to this knee, but I'm not going to draw it too stiffly. I'm going to try to imagine these floating a little bit so I keep some of that looseness. And then as it comes down, it's going to start out wider near the top, and as it gets down towards the bottom, it's going to taper a little bit. It's not going to become boxy quite like our wrist does, but it's going to taper into your ankle. And I've even seen some people start to use this to depict the ankle by jutting out kind of corners into it. The ankle is a really tricky section to depict because it's such a bony area. If you're having trouble doing it, I highly recommend you study what's happening down there very closely. But I believe there's a bone that sticks out in the ankle, and it sticks out a bit higher on the inside of your leg than it does on the outside. Is that right? Let me look at my own ankle. Yes, I think that is correct. So I have a bone, it kind of sticks out like that on the inside of the ankle, and then on the other side of the ankle, it sticks out a bit lower. So an important thing to keep in mind is that while your anatomy is going to be symmetrical, if you split someone like straight down the front, as soon as you start looking into arms and legs and just splitting your individual arms and legs down the middle, they are not going to be symmetrical for the most part, because those muscles need to be able to push and pull against each other in order to work effectively. So when you're drawing your ankle, try not to draw it out as just two bumps like this leading up into a leg that again has two bumps like this. I call this, I call this, and I've heard other people refer to it as drawing like almost like a balloon figure, is trying to depict this anatomy as if it's like bumpy on either side and symmetrical like this. It's going to look odd. So keep in mind what your own anatomy does. These little bones of the feet are gonna, bones of the ankle are gonna be slightly asymmetrical on your foot. And then that goes into the foot, which I'm going to depict very, very simply as just a rectangular cube. Let's say we're seeing more of the top plane of it and maybe the front of your foot a bit. I'm saying you, this hypothetical person that I am drawing right now. So I'm going to draw the front plane of that foot first, and then I'm going to move the rest of that plane back in space where I'm going to see a good amount of the top of it, but not the entire top of it, and then as well as the side of it. And something to note about your foot, this is a very, very simplified version of the foot, is that it doesn't, like your leg doesn't come down like this and then foot stick out like that. It works more like your leg comes down and then your foot sticks out onto it like this. There's a little bit of this backside that's kind of jutting out where your heel is. One way I've seen a lot of people depict that is if I draw this again on the side, if I have the tube that is my leg, I see a lot of people depict this back part of the heel more as a triangle, and then this front part of the foot, I've seen it depicted more like similar to the hand, like a rectangular shape that's a little bit folded or a little bit flexed, leading into your toes, where your toes are. So this is another way that you can try to depict it. Again, whatever way works for you, more complicated or simpler, so that you can better understand how to orient people in space as you go. So that is my very simplified version of the leg. I did want to get into foreshortening a bit more and how to depict that. If you guys have any specific points of anatomy that you are having trouble with, like the muscles around the neck, or even like I am probably not going to do feet and hands too much right now just because they can get a little too complicated for the amount of time that we have left. But or your armpit or your shoulder or anything like that you want to see how to depict it a bit more realistically, let me know in the comments now, and I can try to get one in before we leave. But I'm going to talk a little bit right now about foreshortening and how to capture that a bit better as it's turned in space. So I'm going to switch to a different color pencil at this point. Let me use a brown. I think that'd be good. I apologize for people who are red-green colorblind because I realized I picked poor choices for that, but I think this is darker in value, so you should still be able to see it. I'm going to use a brown right now. I'm going to move over to this part of my page. So foreshortening, if I pull out my little diagram right here, you can see I tried to evenly space these cubes apart so that in perspective they look like they are equidistant apart from each other. But you can see down here, the further these cubes got away from my horizon line, the more they started to overlap. The more they started to kind of stack on top of each other. And that is a bit of what foreshortening is. It's really shapes just stacking up on top of each other so they start to obscure each other. Like, I think we're about, here in the United States, we're about to get an eclipse in April. That's kind of what I'm talking about, is that, you know, you have your moon or your sun overlapping each other. And so you're not going to see as much of one as you are of the other. And that is similar to what is happening with foreshortening. So I showed you guys, I believe they actually used it on the thumbnail in the advanced perspective drawing class. But I showed you guys in a previous perspective drawing class that if you look into the picture-in-picture right now, you can see that I have my arm facing straight at you. And you can't really see my shoulder or much of the rest of my arm right now. You're really just going to see my fist. Please don't use this as the thumbnail again. I'm going to put that out there to Jamie. Don't do it. You're going to see a lot more of the fist, and it's like you're not going to see any of my shoulder. In fact, my fist looks fairly large right now. And you can see the proportions of my fist actually looks about the same as my head. If I obviously can't do this accurately with just my fingers, but if I keep it out here, yeah, there you go. It looks about the same proportions as my head. So that's another thing to keep in mind. When I was talking about proportions earlier, the closer something is to you, the larger it's going to look, and the farther away from it is, the smaller it's going to look. So if you're thinking about proportions a lot when you're drawing in perspective, that's where things can get really confusing. And why I kind of wanted you to be looser with it, because the more important thing is that things look larger as they're closer to you, and they're smaller as they get farther away, and less of like, well, this part of the arm is going to be equal to this part of the arm, because if I move my arm away in space, then this part of my arm is not going to be equal to this part. You're going to be able to see more of this part, and it's going to look larger. So this part of my arm is going to appear smaller, which is why proportions can get very confusing when you're depicting things in perspective, and why I wanted you guys to keep that in mind, but not have it at the forefront when we're thinking about perspective. So yeah, we have a question.
Sue on Facebook just didn't want you to forget about the elbow part.
Oh, the elbow! Oh, thank you. The elbow. Okay, I'm going to draw in another arm really fast. I'll get back to foreshortening. We got time. Okay. So I'm going to draw another top tube for your arm. I'm going to abandon this one because we're not going to be able to see much of what's happening with the elbow when it comes to this perspective, since those tubes are going to kind of be eclipsing what's happening a little bit. But I have this top tube for the arm, and then let's say the other part of my arm, the forearm, is going, like we're looking at it from the back. We're looking at someone from the back, and this part of the forearm is moving away from us in space. So I have a cylinder right here for the front of this. Again, I'm floating these. I'm not connecting them just yet. And then as this cylinder goes away, it's going to become more of that boxier shape of the wrist. So this is my arm, and this is where our elbow is going to go right here. And when you're connecting these two shapes together, and I might have even needed to put these a little overlapping a little bit more than they are right now, but I'm going to show you what I have right now anyway. When you're drawing the elbow, you want to think of it similar to the knee. It's going to be boxy because it's bony. You know, soft tissue you want to kind of keep rounded when you're simplifying the forms, and then bony structures you want to keep more stiff and more square-like to help you kind of get an idea of what that bony structure is going to look like. So when I go into the elbow, I can draw it just the same way I did the knee. I can draw it as a cube. Lots of people will draw it as a circle. I like to draw mine kind of like a triangle, just connecting them, and think of it less as a three-dimensional object, which I know is a bit confusing because we're talking about moving three-dimensional objects around in space. But I find with the elbow, it tends to be very triangular when it's jutting out of the side. And then I almost like to think of it, if we're getting into more complex anatomy, as like having a rod going through it, which sounds kind of disturbing. But when it comes to that anatomy, you have kind of, it's a very, very bony structure, right? It's very square-like, if I show you guys on the camera here. And this is the part that I'm depicting as very triangular, because you can see just how angular that starts to look. You can even see how all this fatty muscle that I have right here in my arm, how it's having that rounder form, and then when it gets to the elbow, it gets really, really pointy and really, really bony. So that's what I'm trying to capture here when I'm doing this kind of forearm structure. And when I say when there's a rod going through it, I'm trying to capture this width of the elbow right here, which there's a bone that sticks out right here that I can't remember the name of right now. Either your ulna or your radium or something, not radium, radia. My anatomy professor would be so disappointed. And then this smaller bone right here, it's gonna create kind of a square shape. And so this is the width that I'm trying to capture when I'm depicting that rod kind of going through it. And that's gonna help you capture the boniness a bit too. And then if I start depicting this arm and trying to like actually draw the skin out, let me see if I can do this. I'm gonna switch to different colors so you guys can see it a bit better. Let me do like a really bright red. Hopefully that'll show up well. Okay. So I can see it a bit better. A note on overlapping forms like this. Since I have this cylinder in front of this one, this line of the elbow where the crease is going to come in front of it. So the thing you wouldn't want to do when you're drawing this is to have this form kind of going away from space and to have this line right here coming like that if I draw on a really simple elbow. This is going to confuse your perspective. You want to make sure this right here is the form that's in front, and so its edge is going to continue into the elbow rather than this form back here continuing into the elbow. This is going to be a very different looking perspective than that. And it's a common mistake that I see a lot of people make when they're trying to overlap forms like this. But I have the elbow coming down there, and then I have, sorry, not the elbow, the crease in your arm that meets the elbow coming down right there. And then I have a bit more of that muscle and bone coming in for the elbow. Not the cleanest elbow I've ever done. It's looking very, very bony. I might have actually needed to make that rod come out a bit more. You know, come out a bit more like this. And then I'm just free drawing this right now. And then, you know, you have your biceps coming down. You have that more rounded form of the forearm coming into like your wrist where the hand would be. That's a very boxy looking hand, but you kind of see that's the elbow that I'm trying to depict here. And this is that boxy form, this part coming down where the triangle of the elbow is. And then this bony part that's coming up is that rod that I tried to draw through it. So hopefully that explains it a bit more. Again, that's on the more complicated side, so you can also just go to depicting it as a trusty square or sphere if that is more suited to you and if that's going to help a little bit. I've even seen people depict it a bit like a teardrop shape, like this. So like this end would be the bonier part of the elbow, and then this would be the inner part of the elbow when you're depicting your arms. If you want to take that spherical shape and play on it a little bit, that is a great one to do. But before we end, I did want to touch on foreshortening a little bit more than I did. I talked on it, but I want to show you guys how to illustrate it, which is essentially taking every box and sphere structure and trying to stack it on top of each other, coming towards you in perspective. So I'm going to draw something that is, it's coming towards us in perspective, but we're going to have a slight top view on it. So it's not going to be quite what I showed you earlier with my fist, where you're not able to see really any of my arm, but just a little bit. It's going to be tilted forward a little bit, so you can see a tiny bit of my arm, but mostly my fist. So if I start drawing this out really quickly, I'm going to draw a very boxy shape for my fist. Because I'm not going to deal with the fingers or anything. I'm just going to treat this like a nice solid cube that is coming towards us. So I'm going to see, again, a little bit of the top of it, but most of the plane that I'm going to be seeing is that front plane because it is coming towards us. I'm going to see more of the front plane, and I'm only going to see a tiny little bit of what that top plane looks like. And then from there, I can kind of figure out what that side plane is going to look like. And then after that, I want to try and get my forearm shape. And so again, I talked about earlier how you want that kind of boxier structure coming forward. So I'm going to try to start. This is going to be a very awkward stack since you kind of want to draw it coming back and going forward rather than forward back. But I wanted to show you guys a starting point of the hand since that was a very prominent part of what I just showed you. And so if I start drawing my hand out here and my wrist right there, you're not going to see very much of it. I might only see like a tiny bit of the side. Since I drew this kind of offside and I can see this side, but I can't see that side, we're going to see more of the inner side of this arm than we are of this outer side. So I'm going to draw this boxier shape going back in space, and then I'm going to try to depict that meatier part of the arm. And I'm keeping in mind here that things are going to get smaller as they go away from me. So when I see that meatier part of the arm, and when I think about, like, if that meatier part of the arm, if I just depict it as a sphere or a circle, and then I try to depict that bonier part of the arm coming forward, this is kind of the shape that it's going to take on, where I'm going to see that front plane of the wrist. So this is without the hand, this is just the forearm, and then I'm going to see that rounder part in the back, because as a, as a cylinder turns towards you in space so that you just see one of the flat sides, it's going to turn into a circle because you're just seeing that circular one side of it. And so you're just seeing the circular side of this forearm that maybe I'll draw more as like an ellipse to kind of capture that width that's in the arm, and then that bonier part of the wrist. That's going to be what this begins to look like. And then actually I'm going to scrap this because I feel like it's not a great image of what I want to depict right now. This is a little bit better. And then if I start to try and draw the rest of the arm up here, I'm going to see very, very little of it, but I might see just a tiny bit, which honestly I might be able to just depict as a sphere that's coming up behind that. And then if I draw in my hand right here, because I had excluded my hand previously, it would be a very boxy looking fist. And now I'm gonna take this and I'm gonna try to draw a more realistic hand so you guys can see a bit better what that is getting at. So I'm gonna draw another color. And I'm actually gonna look at my own hand for reference, because as much as I can try to draw all of these spaces without looking at a reference, I still need a reference for my hand. So excuse me while I try to get all the knuckles and everything of my hand done really quickly, because I want to try to give you guys a better idea of how this looks. You can see a little bit of the fingers coming down, and the thumb again hooks into that more triangular shape, and I can see it kind of hooking towards me. If you guys can see, this is what I'm doing with my hand right now. That is what that hand looks like, and then the rest of the forearm as it goes back in space, again I'm going to see a bit of that forearm, and I'm going to draw it more as a wide sphere than anything, because really this forearm is wider than it is tall, and then when it gets into your biceps on your triceps, it's taller than it is wide. So you have a little bit of a shape that's kind of like this when it comes to your forearm, where like this part is wider and then this part is taller when it comes to the musculature there. And I know you can't see that very well, so I'm gonna hold it up a bit. So if this is my wrist, hypothetical wrist is over here, and then your shoulder's in this direction, when those two spheres connect, this part of the forearm is a bit wider, and then this part of the upper arm is taller when it comes to those spheres, if you're looking at things realistically. So I depicted this more as a rounder sphere, and then when it comes into drawing the rest of my forearm, I'm going to draw it as a bit of a taller sphere. And then, the rest of my body might be over here if I draw a very simplified look at that. That's very, very fast. But essentially this is foreshortening right here, and that is this shape depicted a bit more realistically, so you guys have a better idea of what that looks like. So, and you can see here I even tried to depict my head as about the same size as my fist, because that's what I saw when I looked into the camera. So, alright, that was drawing people in perspective, and that was a lot covered in a very short span of time. So if you guys have any questions that weren't answered during the show, don't worry, I will be going back through the chat in Facebook tomorrow and answering any questions that weren't answered. And if you have any questions on Facebook that weren't answered, leave them as a comment underneath the video so that I can reply to them, because you can't do that on the actual chat. On YouTube. Yeah. Did I say Facebook again? I meant on YouTube. Thank you, Amanda. And yeah, thank you guys so much for coming. Part of my undergraduate degree was biology and anatomy, so I love talking about it. And I have lots of information about anatomy. If you guys have any very specific questions about it, I'm happy to answer them. Yeah, and check us out for next week. Emmy is going to be doing an expressive acrylic pet portrait. It's a two-part series, so she's doing part one next week, where she's going to be showing you guys how to capture the underpainting for that. So I'm really excited about that, because I know she's been doing some lovely paintings of her new kitten, which is so cute. Yeah, thank you guys so much for coming tonight, and bye-bye!